Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Bai Xiaochun was stunned to hear that Big Fatty Zhang had actually done so well in the Vile Emperor dynasty. As for the giant ghost king, although he had never heard of Big Fatty Zhang before, he was also taken aback. This Big Fatty Zhang sounds like a brilliant character. He single-handedly made a place for himself in the Vile Emperor dynasty. I guess people with good names are just destined for greatness. In the giant ghost king's opinion, the fact that Big Fatty Zhang had the character Big in his name went to prove how much of a manly fellow he was. It was much better than the character Small. He couldn't help but sigh with regret at not having met him back in the wildlands. 1. At this point, the giant ghost king suddenly seemed to think of something, and excitedly said, Hey, Celestial Gongsun, does Big Fatty Zhang have a Taoist partner? Bai Xiaochun was not very happy, and immediately cast a glare in the giant ghost king's direction. He knew how much the giant ghost king liked to play matchmaker. After all, he'd pushed his own daughter on him. Now he was asking about Big Fatty Zhang, leading to an obvious question: did he have another illegitimate daughter out there somewhere? When the giant ghost king noticed Bai Xiaochun staring at him, he chuckled guiltily. The truth was that he had no illegitimate daughters. However, he had become quite used to being connected to powerful people through female relatives. Just now, he had been considering trying to adopt a new daughter, and then somehow get her together with Big Fatty Zhang as a Taoist partner. That would give him a new son-in-law, and if that son-in-law could go on to subjugate the world, and if his daughter could subjugate her husband, then that would put the giant ghost king in a position unparalleled under heaven. Bai Xiaochun could guess much of what the giant ghost king was thinking, and was of the opinion that it was a complete disgrace. At the same time, he felt bad for Big Fatty Zhang. Gongsun Wanner had only provided a brief description of where he ended up, but it was easy to imagine the difficulties and dangers he had faced along the way. After all, Big Fatty Zhang had started out in a strange world, away from his friends and family, with only a nascent soul cultivation base. Step by step, he had established himself and earned a place in the Vile Emperor dynasty, all because of his spirit enhancement abilities. It was something that not every spirit enhancer could do. As for Hu Xiaomei, Bai Xiaochun could finally rest at ease. Although he didn't quite consider himself friends with Gongsun Wanner, they were at least allies. And it didn't seem like she was hiding anything from him. Therefore, he actually felt happy with how things had turned out for Hu Xiaomei. In the Eternal Lands, where danger abounded, Hu Xiaomei had managed to stay safe the entire time. And considering her talents, whether it was Ghost Mother or Gongsun Wanner, both would have good reason to take care of her in the future. Feeling a bit better about things, Bai Xiaochun looked at the clouds whizzing by, and thought back to his other friends and family from the Heavenspan realm. Wanner, you're a celestial, so, can you tell me what's involved in becoming like you? Although Bai Xiaochun was currently a quasi-celestial, his situation was not ideal. He had reached the Great Circle of the Undying Codex, but not the Live Forever Codex. And his cultivation base was still in the demigod realm. Even he wasn't quite sure of where he stood in terms of cultivation ranking. He did know that when he reached the Great Circle of the full Undying Live Forever technique, he could rise to the level of a celestial. But in terms of the exact process, he wasn't very clear. Being in the early celestial realm, Gongsun Wanner obviously knew a lot more about the situation than Bai Xiaochun. The giant ghost king's ears also perked up. Considering how long he had been a demigod, he knew a bit more about the subject than Bai Xiaochun, but was still very interested in learning more. Gongsun Wanner laughed softly and began to toy with a stray lock of her hair. That simple action made her seem even more beautiful than ever, perhaps even flirtatious. Her captivating eyes and long black hair would make anyone who looked at her itch with desire. The licentious giant ghost king's eyes were already shining brightly. Even Bai Xiaochun's heart was beating a bit faster. But then he thought about Gongsun Wanner's past, and he reminded himself that he had to be vigilant. She was a demoness, and he was in a much different position than he had been in the past. Then again, he couldn't let himself be intimidated just because she was a beautiful woman. Opening his eyes wide, he looked at her solemnly. Then, after a moment of thought, he quickly sized up her body. When Gongsun Wanner realized that two sets of eyes were checking her out, she smiled charmingly. Looking a bit flushed, she then said, "Don't look at me like that, sweetie. If you want to see more, why don't we go into the cabin, and I'll let you have a closer look. What do you say?" The giant ghost king shivered and swallowed hard, whereas Bai Xiaochun's eyes widened, and he subconsciously inched backward a bit. It's a good thing I've got a lot of self-control, he thought. This Gongsun Wan'er is more of a vixen than Song Junwan or Mistress Red Dust, but thankfully, I'm immune to this type of stuff. And I have a big sword. Casting a contemptuous glance at the giant ghost king, he cleared his throat, smacked his bag of holding, and produced the great sword of the north in a blue flash of light. With that, he jumped up and made a few practice swings before looking back at Gongsun Wan'er in what he hoped was a very intimidating fashion. What were you just saying? You wanted me to have a closer look at something? The giant ghost king wasn't quite sure whether to laugh or cry, but at the same time, couldn't help but admire Bai Xiaochun. To pull out the great sword of the north in such an intimate moment could not have been an easy thing to do. A mix of fear and bitterness could be seen in Gongsun Wan'er's eyes as she looked at the sword. The cultivation system in the Eternal Lands is the same as in the Heavenspan realm, she said quietly. After nascent soul is the Diva realm, then demigod, and finally celestial. What's different is the source of power. In the Eternal Lands, the source of all power is will. Devas overtake the will of the heavens, and use the power of heaven and earth. That process is what awakens willpower within them. As for demigods, their will surpasses that of the heavens. They don't borrow it, they take it. That further awakens their willpower, and allows a will root to form. As for celestials, after breaking out of the demigod realm and entering the Mahayana realm, they will take their will root and use it to form a Deoseed. During the course of cultivation, the Deoseed will eventually grow roots and sprout, merging with the body. In the final breakthrough, it will blossom, which creates Tao will. When that happens, you break out of the celestial realm. If anyone accomplished that, they would become the third Archean realm emperor in the world. Unfortunately, that is extremely difficult. Right now, we only have 2 emperors, both of whom have Tao will, and are Archean realm experts. Both Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king were completely shaken by what they had just heard. Willpower, will root, Deoseed, Tao will, Bai Xiaochun murmured. All things in the world have willpower, Gongsun Wan'er continued. It's a foundation that can come in infinite forms. Heaven, earth, the world, all living things that exist. All plants and all types of vegetation. The world is like a mountain, with those on the top easily crushing everyone beneath them. As for those on the bottom, they have to struggle relentlessly to climb higher. First, turn willpower into a root, and bury it in the spiritual sea. Eventually, it becomes a Deoseed, which gives birth to Tao will. There is no limitation to the divine abilities and Taoist magics that celestials wield, the reason being that anything in creation can be used as the basis for their magic. That is because of the Deoseed. Only when the Deoseed appears is a person a truly mighty celestial, a person who surpasses all heaven and earth. When it comes to the willpower which exists as a fundamental part of all living things, from ancient times until now, there have been different understandings and explanations. Most people believe that willpower is similar to faith. For example, when Ghost Mother used her Taoist magic, she drew upon the power of the faith of all the people in the Vile Emperor dynasty. Faith is also a fundamental reason why the imperial dynasties stand to begin with. Although I don't fully understand how the Archean realm works, I do know that the more lands an Archean controls, and the more people live in those lands, the stronger that Archean can be. Also, Deoseeds are more important to celestials than their divine soul. It is the foundation of everything. Anyone who has a Deoseed but dies can be resurrected by an Archean realm expert. Both Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king were visibly moved by her words. Resurrected? The giant ghost king asked. Resurrected, Gongsun Wan'er repeated. That is why Archeans are emperors. Years ago, the Saint Emperor dynasty was almost completely crushed. However, once the Saint Emperor made his breakthrough, the Vile Emperor had no choice but to back down. No one really knows how powerful Archeans really are. The 2 emperors have never fought each other directly. The only thing we know for sure is that they are strong enough to resurrect celestials. Gongsun Wan'er looked at Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king, aware of how shocking her words must be to people who had never heard any of this information before. And she was right. Bai Xiaochun was panting, and the giant ghost king felt like he was being struck with waves of shock. Only now were they coming to understand how truly powerful the 2 imperial dynasties were. What they had seen so far was only the tip of the iceberg. Any demigod cultivator who breaks through and becomes a celestial must form a Deoseed and then deliver part of it to the Tao Palace of the imperial dynasty they serve. Then, if that celestial dies, the Archean emperor can use that Deoseed to perform the resurrection. Gongsun Wan'er paused for a moment to give Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king a moment to digest everything she had said up to this point. Then she continued, discounting the emperors, who normally do not take action, the celestials have the greatest battle prowess in the eternal lands. Of course, resurrecting a celestial does not come without a price. Not only is it very draining to the Archean, but the resurrected celestial will forever be weaker than before. Because of that, celestials will do anything in their power to avoid perishing. At this point, Gongsun Wanner stopped talking for a moment to think. There were more things to say that she could hold back, but they weren't exactly secrets. And once Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king got to the Saint Emperor dynasty, they would eventually learn of them. Therefore, there was little reason for her to not tell them. As for my true self, even if you or the Saint Emperor killed her, she would still come back to life. However, in order to keep the status quo, and to maintain the goodwill of the other celestials in the dynasty, the vile emperor will almost certainly work out a deal to get her back. Bai Xiaochun's eyes were shining by this point. Not only had he learned much more about how to become a celestial, but he now also knew much more about the shocking nature of the two emperors. However, after hearing the talk about resurrection, he had another suspicion that was even stronger than before. Is Taoist Heavenspan dead or not? Back when the Heavenspan realm had been destroyed, Taoist Heavenspan's body exploded, and something that looked like a seed had flown out. He was only a quasi-celestial. He couldn't have formed a Daoseed, could he? He also thought about how, after arriving in the eternal immortal domains, he was able to use the great sword of the north without any limitations, and yet, the sword had no true master. Eventually, he put such thoughts to the side and looked back at Gongsun Wanner. He didn't care too much about whether or not she was given back to the vile emperor. He needed her to use as his blood tribute. He had long since guessed that there were reasons he hadn't understood that prompted her to give herself up to him. What's after the Archean realm? He asked. After the Archean realm? Gongsun Wanner smiled, her eyes shining with what appeared to be anticipation. After the Archean realm is the sovereign realm. Up to now, there have only ever been 3 sovereigns in our lands. They all existed at the same time, and were the forefathers of all humanity. Presumably, you already know about them. After all, the myths and legends that we all talk about in the eternal lands are true. Sighing, she looked up into the sky. The giant ghost king silently did the same, peering up at the huge face and 2 enormous hands. Every time the giant ghost king and Bai Xiaochun looked up at the strange sky overhead, their hearts and minds trembled. Not even I am sure about how to break out of the Archean realm and into the sovereign realm. Only the 2 emperors have any clue about that. With that, she shifted her gaze to the eternal sea. Down below, a mist could be seen on the surface of the sea, and beneath it, an enormous shape. That shape was the landmass that existed in the very middle of the eternal sea. Perhaps, island was the best word to describe it. It was a holy location in the eternal lands, the place from which all people had originated. In the past, 3 enormous statues had existed there. After dying, the sovereigns became huge statues. Bai Xiaochun looked over to where one of those statues had recently stood. The only thing visible there now was a huge footprint. Back when the arch-sovereign had been standing, Bai Xiaochun had lived inside his body, which was the Heavenspan realm. No one spoke as the bone lizard battleship shot through the mists. Eventually, they were past the island and speeding along over the waves of the eternal sea. At that point, Bai Xiaochun murmured a single word. Sovereign. The rest of the trip was made in silence. The giant ghost king was thinking about the wildlands, Bai Xiaochun reminisced about the river-defying sect, and Gongsun Wanner was filled with endless sighs. After all, she was the focus of the current situation, and the closer she got to the Saint Emperor dynasty, the more worried she got, although she didn't let it show. Eventually, they were closing in on the immortal domain belonging to the Saint Emperor dynasty. At that point, Bai Xiaochun rose to his feet. We're almost there. Gongsun Wanner, please don't take offense. Gongsun Wanner frowned slightly and nodded. She had known all along that she would be sealed eventually, not to harm her, but to send the right message, and also to make sure that she was eventually traded back to the vile emperor. Smiling at Bai Xiaochun flirtatiously, she said, "Be gentle, sweetie. Don't make it hurt." Bai Xiaochun's heart trembled in response, and the giant ghost king began to pant. Looking at her, Bai Xiaochun muttered a few words under his breath, then quickly performed an incantation gesture to send an invisible sealing mark into Gongsun Wanner. After being restricted, her energy faded slightly, and she sat down, ashen-faced and gasping for breath. And yet, her pitiful state only made her look more attractive. Not daring to lay eyes on her, Bai Xiaochun kept his eyes focused on the distant immortal domain. As the landmass grew larger and larger, he shivered inwardly, and then narrowed his eyes. He had just sensed a powerful aura up ahead, something explosive and dangerous, like an unsheathed sword. In response to it, the sky vibrated, and a screaming wind kicked up, causing the waves on the eternal sea to rise to incredible heights. At the same time, a beam of sword chi shot out from the immortal domain. It was fully 30,000 meters across, and powerful enough to crush anything in its path. As it closed in, the bone lizard shivered, and its eyes began to shine brightly. The air around the battleship was instantly sealed, causing intense pressure to weigh down that seemed capable of reducing anything and everything beneath it to a bloody paste. A serious expression appeared on the giant Ghost King's face, and blood began to ooze out of his mouth. Gongsun Wanner's expression flickered, and Bai Xiaochun looked out, his heart pounding. A moment later, the sword chi resolved into the shape of a handsome, middle-aged man in a white robe, with long white hair. It was with ice-cold eyes that he studied the battleship in front of him. That gaze was as explosive as heavenly lightning. In response to his presence, the sky shuddered, and the eternal sea went still. As for the bone lizard, it didn't dare to keep flying, and immediately came to a halt. Gu Tianjun, Gongsun Wanner said. She no longer looked cute and charming. Instead, her eyes shone with mysterious light, but at the same time, terror. The white-robed, white-haired Gu Tianjun looked at Gongsun Wanner, and then at Bai Xiaochun. Voice utterly calm, he said, delivery accepted. Now, please leave. Rage immediately rose up in the giant Ghost King's heart, and Bai Xiaochun's eyes flickered with cold light. The pressure weighing down on them, and the words which had just been spoken, crossed the bottom line for the both of them. Gu Tianjun had come, with ill intentions. Gu Tianjun had always looked down on people from the Heavenspan realm. Back before the body of the Arch-Sovereign collapsed, he had somewhat looked forward to the arrival of the Arch-Emperor dynasty. But after the collapse, as more people from the Heavenspan realm became part of the Saint Emperor dynasty, things changed. As time progressed, he learned more and more about what had gone on in the Heavenspan realm. Endless chaos and disorder. And they never even raised someone to the Mahayana realm. Considering how late they are, they're doomed to be little more than servants. Completely useless. Gu Tianjun was the type of person who looked up to those who were more powerful than him, but at the same time, wanted to defeat them and take their place. That was something about him that not even the Saint Emperor could find fault with. After all, when it came to bloodlines, Gu Tianjun was also a direct descendant of the original Saint Emperor. As for people who were weaker than him, he viewed them like bugs. And there were plenty of bugs in the Saint Emperor dynasty. As for people from the Heavenspan realm, he placed them beneath the bugs. A lot of people talked about their abilities with spirit enhancement, and although that was of slight interest to Gu Tianjun, he still viewed it as a mere skill, like pill concocting or equipment forging. With such skills, the people of Heavenspan still only qualified to serve the other two great powers in the lands. They were doomed to be slaves. As far as the people he was dealing with right now, they were just two Heavenspan people who didn't even count as bugs. Due to some lucky break, they had managed to kidnap a celestial, but that did nothing to reduce the disdain that Gu Tianjun felt for them. They just want help from the Saint Emperor dynasty. After a few breaths worth of time, Gu Tianjun began to get impatient at the fact that his words were still hanging in the air. Taking a step forward, he completely ignored Bai Xiaochun and the giant Ghost King, used his shocking sword chi to rip apart the defensive shield protecting the bone lizard battleship, and then landed on the deck in front of Gongsun Wanner. One reason for the ease with which he passed through the defenses was the fact that Gongsun Wanner had already been sealed. "Hello, Ghost Mother," he said, smiling. In contrast to the two Heavenspan cultivators, he was very interested in Ghost Mother. Years ago, he had severed her arm, and this was his first time seeing her again since then. Although she was currently in a very weak state, since she was a celestial, he viewed her as being slightly above the other bugs in the world. Bai Xiaochun stood there staring coldly and quietly at Gu Tianjun. As for the giant Ghost King, considering how long he had lived, he could easily discern from the coldness being shown how this person looked down upon them. Furthermore, it was obvious that he had no intention of letting them into Saint Emperor City to hand Ghost Mother over. From the look of things, the supposed blood tribute was turning out to be nothing more than a joke. Struggling to control himself, he stepped forward, clasped hands, and bowed. "Greetings, exalted celestial. We plan to personally escort Ghost Mother into—" "Shut up," Gu Tianjun said, waving his hand dismissively. "You want a reward, right? Well, go back to where you came from and wait. Your reward will come eventually." With that, he reached out to grab Gongsun Wanner. However, before he could, Bai Xiaochun suddenly started laughing coldly. Inside, he was very nervous. After all, he could sense that Gu Tianjun was on a different level than Ghost Mother. He was actually much stronger. But even if he were stronger, Bai Xiaochun would not tolerate him intruding and condescending in this way. And there was no way he would simply let Gongsun Wan'er be taken away. He didn't waste any time speaking. Blue light flashed as the great sword of the north appeared, unleashing heaven-shaking, earth-shattering pressure. Then, he blurred into motion, slashing the sword at Jiyu Tianjun. Jiyu Tianjun's expression flickered as he turned his head to see what was happening. When he saw the great sword of the north, his pupils constricted, and he swung his hand from Gongsun Wan'er toward the sword as if to grab it. When the sword made contact with Jiyu Tianjun's hand, a huge boom erupted out, along with a massive shockwave. Before Jiyu Tianjun knew what was happening, he staggered backward and off of the battleship. Bai Xiaochun felt all of his qi and blood vibrating inside of him from the power of the sword. Any other demigod, and even an ordinary quasi-celestial, would have been seriously injured by it. But Bai Xiaochun had his undying live forever technique, and could essentially recover from any injury in the blink of an eye. Therefore, he stood there on the battleship, staring up with a cold, grim expression at Jiyu Tianjun. What incredible gall, Jiyu Tianjun said, eyes narrowing. Although he was shocked by Bai Xiaochun's powers of regeneration, he also couldn't help but look greedily at the huge sword he held. As of this moment, the giant Ghost King's heart was in his throat. Off to the side, mixed emotions could be seen in Gongsun Wan'er's eyes. Although Bai Xiaochun seemed to be standing there bravely, she knew that he was secretly nervous. But at the same time, she also realized that he had changed. After all, she knew him better than the giant Ghost King. In the past, whenever he faced an enemy more powerful than himself, he would try to resolve any tensions. But now, he simply drew his sword and attacked. Is he really going to take a stand? She thought. As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun seemed as lofty as a mountain as he stood there in front of her. Bai Xiaochun held his tongue for a brief moment. He knew that this was a very critical moment, and that he only had one chance to succeed. Therefore, he drew on everything he had learned in the wildlands to quell his nervousness. Gall, he said loudly. Your name is Jiyu Tianjun, right? Well, let me tell you, you're right. I do have gall. If I had no gall, how could I have left a swath of blood and death behind me as I left the vile emperor dynasty? If I had no gall, how could I possibly have kidnapped a celestial and several demigods? If I had no gall, I would have just let you steal what is mine. So, yes, I have gall. However, you also have quite a bit of gall yourself. As he spoke, his voice grew louder and louder until his words echoed like heavenly thunder. Jiyu Tianjun's expression flickered from the incisiveness of Bai Xiaochun's words. The truth was, there was nothing he could say to refute what had just been said. Eyes glittering with coldness, he prepared to say something, but before he could, Bai Xiaochun spoke in an even louder voice than before. I brought this vile emperor dynasty celestial here, and you blocked my path. Why? Because you lack integrity, Jiyu Tianjun. Let me ask you a question. Do you serve the Saint Emperor? Or the vile emperor? Jiyu Tianjun's eyes grew even colder, and yet before he could say anything, Bai Xiaochun continued in thunderous fashion. I favor the Saint Emperor dynasty, and came here to offer formal greetings. Not empty-handed, but with a gift. But you blocked my path at the front door, Jiyu Tianjun. And there is one word for that. Rude. Let me ask you another question. What logical basis do you have for your actions? With that, Bai Xiaochun took a step forward. I fought and killed my way here from the vile emperor dynasty, and now you want to steal my spoils of war? There is one word for that. Immoral. So now I'll ask you a third question, Jiyu Tianjun. What right do you have to steal my gift? Bai Xiaochun took another step forward, taking him off of the battleship and up into the air, where he pointed out with the great sword of the north. I am the arch-ancestor of the Heavenspan realm. Therefore, in the eternal lands, there are only two people who rank as high as me. The vile emperor and the saint emperor. How dare you try to boss me around, Jiyu Tianjun? There is one word for that. Disrespectful. Therefore, I will now ask you a fourth question. Considering that you are a rude, immoral, and disrespectful creature, and also lack integrity, where the hell did you get that gall of yours? As his words echoed out, blue light from the great sword of the north shone out to fill the area. All of the demigods who had accompanied Jiyu Tianjun from the immortal domain were shaken, and even Jiyu Tianjun himself felt as if he had been stabbed to the heart by the words which had just been spoken. Never could Jiyu Tianjun have possibly imagined that this Heavenspan cultivator would have such a sharp tongue. There was literally nothing he could possibly say by way of retort. At this point, anything he said would come across as sounding like a flimsy excuse. If he were in some remote location where no one was watching, he could simply shrug off what had just been said. But he was here, with many celestials paying attention. Furthermore, he had to consider the reputation of the Saint Emperor dynasty as a whole. Therefore, Bai Xiaochun's tirade forced him into a passive position, and caused his face to flush red with embarrassment and anger. And the killing intent in his eyes grew even stronger. As for the giant Ghost King and Gongsun Wanner, they were both staring at Bai Xiaochun, astonished at how domineering he was. Ignoring Gu Tianjun, Bai Xiaochun swished his sleeve and looked in the direction of Saint Emperor City. Sweeping his sword in grand fashion, he called out in a voice that boomed like the loudest thunder. Saint Emperor, is this how you treat visitors who come to see you in good faith? The truth was that he was more nervous than could possibly be expressed in words. In fact, he had already decided that, if necessary, he would unseal Gongsun Wanner and try to flee on the battleship. However, years of practice at this sort of thing ensured that not even a scrap of such feelings showed on his face. Instead, he looked confident and arrogant to the extreme. A moment passed, and his anxiety mounted. His heart was pounding, and his scalp was tingling. Even as he prepared to turn and run, a warm, somber voice echoed out into heaven and earth. Forgive my negligence, fellow Taoist Bai. Please, come in. The voice echoed about in a way that made it impossible to determine where exactly it came from. It almost seemed to surpass the flow of time itself. Those who heard it felt a connection to the voice, as though it contained a strange power that instantly calmed them down. The giant Ghost King shivered, and Gongsun Wanner's breathing began to steady. As for the demigods who had come from the nearby immortal domain, their eyes shone with reverence as they turned in the direction of Saint Emperor City, clasped hands, and bowed. Gu Tianjun's expression flickered, and he closed his eyes momentarily. When they opened, there was no trace of killing intent or rage. The only thing that remained was frosty coldness. Come with me, fellow Taoist Bai, he said coolly. Bai Xiaochun shivered inwardly at the strange qualities of the Saint Emperor's voice. At the same time, the sliver of willpower which had awoken when facing Ghost Mother's celestial Taoist magic stirred yet again. The Saint Emperor is so powerful, he thought. However, he didn't let any emotions show on his face. Smiling broadly, he clasped hands and gave a slight bow in the direction of Saint Emperor City. Then he returned to the battleship and stood silently on the prow. Gu Tianjun cast a cold glance at Bai Xiaochun, but didn't say anything. A moment later, he turned into a beam of sword light that shot back toward Saint Emperor City. As for the demigods who had come with him, they also looked over at Bai Xiaochun, but this time, their expressions looked very different from before. This guy seems different from the other people of Heavenspan that I've seen. That was what most of the demigods were thinking. Eventually, they looked away, and followed Gu Tianjun to formally escort the newcomers into the Saint Emperor dynasty. The battleship followed along, leaving the eternal sea and heading through the buffeting winds toward Saint Emperor City. Everyone felt a lot of pressure, and no one spoke. 2 hours later, the effects of the Saint Emperor's voice began to fade from the giant Ghost King, whereupon a look of astonishment appeared deep in his eyes. From distant Saint Emperor City, he said a single sentence that put me in a daze for that long? The giant Ghost King was shaken, and his fear of the Archean emperors suddenly grew far deeper. It's because this is your first time dealing with an Archean, Gongsun Wanner said, smiling faintly. And you actually benefited from being a Heavenspan cultivator. Someone from the Saint Emperor dynasty would find their willpower affected for days, during which time they would feel fanatical devotion. Gongsun Wanner currently had her cultivation base sealed, but that didn't affect her overall level. She had her Dao seed, and was also from the Vile Emperor dynasty, and therefore recovered much more quickly, although not as quickly as Bai Xiaochun. If it ever happens to you again, you won't be as severely affected, at least not unless the Archean intentionally makes it worse. After finishing with her explanation, Gongsun Wanner looked over at Bai Xiaochun, who still stood there at the prow of the ship. Curiosity flickered in her eyes. She was truly interested in Bai Xiaochun's uniqueness. I wonder if what he said is true, she thought. Does he really rank as high as the two emperors? Or does he cultivate some technique that gives him the power to stand up to them? As Gongsun Wanner pondered the matter, the giant Ghost King regained more of his senses, and also looked over at Bai Xiaochun. All of a sudden, he realized that maybe Bai Xiaochun really could become the hope of the Heavenspan realm. Bai Xiaochun could sense that the two of them were looking at him. Although his expression remained placid, inwardly he was feeling very pleased with himself. That calmness, and the way he remained steady under pressure earlier, was becoming something of a habit. But then he considered that the emperors of the two dynasties were both experts in the Archean realm, and his nervousness mounted. This won't do, he thought. If I start getting nervous every time I think about them, how am I supposed to stay in a good mood? All of a sudden, his eyes lit up. Hold on, these two dynasties have funny names if you think about it. Vile Emperor Dynasty? Instead of Vile, how about Smile? Yeah, the Smile Emperor. And instead of Saint Emperor Dynasty, how about Paint? Hey, the Paint Emperor. All of a sudden, he felt much more at ease. He also couldn't help but turn to Gongsun Wanner and ask, Wanner, does everyone from the Smile Emperor Dynasty like to smile? What? Gongsun Wanner replied, stunned. Then her eyes hardened into a glare, and any feeling of wonderment from before vanished. After all, never in her life had she ever heard anyone say Smile Emperor before. Gongsun Wanner's glare caused Bai Xiaochun to feel slightly awkward, so he quickly looked away and went back to trying to seem grand and proud. Down below, mountains and rivers stretched out in all directions. The immortal domain they had come to also contained the capital city of the Saint Emperor Dynasty. Therefore, after a few days of travel, they crossed a wide plain and, as evening fell, caught sight of an enormous mountain off in the distance. It rose up dramatically into the sky, and had a very distinct outline. It was definitely the largest mountain Bai Xiaochun had ever seen before in his life, and took up more than half of the prefecture. In fact, it was roughly half the size of the entire Heavenspan realm. A mortal who tried to climb this mountain wouldn't be able to reach the top in an entire lifetime. It was no exaggeration to say that it connected the earth to the heavens. At the very top of the mountain, there was no peak, only a massive heavenly pond. Although the pond looked small when compared to the mountain as a whole, it was still huge. Dense mist roiled out from the pond, connecting it to the surrounding clouds and making the entire place seem like a paradise for immortals. Lotus leaves floated on the surface of the water, each one seemingly as large as an island. In fact, upon closer inspection, all of the lotus leaves actually had spectacularly luxurious buildings on them. There were thousands of such lotus leaves, all of them floating around something even more shocking, which lay at the very middle of the pond. It was a gargantuan lotus flower. It was beautiful to the extreme, and emanated a shockingly pleasing aroma. Built onto the petals of the flower were buildings of the most flawless white jade imaginable. This was the Imperial Palace. The lotus flower was the palace, the lotus leaves were the city. This was none other than the capital of the Saint Emperor Dynasty, a place known as Saint Emperor City. This mountain, this pond, and this city surpassed anything Bai Xiaochun could ever have imagined. Bai Xiaochun wasn't the only one to be shaken. When the giant ghost king caught sight of the heavenly pond, his jaw dropped. It was unlike anything that had ever existed in the Heavenspan realm. Gongsun Wanner was the only one to have little reaction. She had heard of the wonders of Saint Emperor City before, although in her heart, the capital city of the Vile Emperor Dynasty was far grander. Gu Tianjun didn't react to Bai Xiaochun's shock, but the demigods were clearly very proud of their capital city, which was the most holy location in the land. As the battleship got closer to the pond, Bai Xiaochun noticed numerous dragonfish swimming in the water. Occasionally, they would leap out of the water, and when the evening sun landed on their golden scales, it was a dazzling sight. This city amongst the clouds actually surpassed any celestial paradise. Soon, the cultivators who lived in Saint Emperor City noticed the bone lizard battleship sailing through the air above them. Within the imperial palace were all of the officials of the imperial court, whom the Saint Emperor had summoned. When they looked up, some gazes were those of curiosity, while others were hostile. Most were arrogant to the extreme, as if they were the rulers of a massive country looking at common farmers from a tiny nation. Even as Bai Xiaochun and his allies prepared to enter Saint Emperor City itself, a piercing voice echoed out from the imperial palace. The Saint Emperor has summoned Heavenspan realm cultivators Bai Xiaochun and Giant Ghost for an audience. The Giant Ghost King's actual name was not Giant Ghost. Clearly, in the Saint Emperor dynasty, it wouldn't be appropriate to speak the king part of his title aloud. Actually, few people knew the Giant Ghost King's real name, even in the wildlands. As such, he had known all along that something like this would happen. My surname is Zhou, fools, he muttered under his breath. After the imperial decree was issued, Gu Tianjun turned back to look at Bai Xiaochun. For the first time since their initial meeting, he spoke, his voice as cool as ever. The battleship can't go in, fellow Taoist Bai. Please, follow me. Bai Xiaochun looked at Saint Emperor City, and especially the imperial palace on the lotus flower, and could sense that thousands of streams of divine sense were currently locked onto his position. Taking a deep breath, he straightened out his robe, then waved his hand to send Gongsun Wanner into his bag of holding. Followed by the Giant Ghost King, he proceeded onward toward the imperial palace. Chuckling coldly, Gu Tianjun led the way, and soon the three of them were right outside the imperial palace. As they neared, an astonishing pressure erupted from inside, an aggressive blast that prevented Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king from entering. It was not a deadly attack, but it was terrifying enough to make Bai Xiaochun feel like he was being crushed. At the same time, he realized that within the aura was something that reminded him of the frigid matriarch. It was a spirit automaton. A world treasure, he thought, stopping in place. There was also a majestic divine sense that swept over him, confirming both his identity and the giant ghost king's. A moment later, the divine sense vanished. The intense pressure only lasted for a moment, but it caused the giant ghost king to begin to sweat profusely, and even gasp for breath. Then he and Bai Xiaochun entered the main gate of the imperial palace to find themselves at the bottom of a staircase so steep and tall it seemed like a mountain. There were roughly 10,000 stairs, and at the top of them all was the enormous palace hall. A huge crowd was gathered, their backs to the staircase. A narrow path led straight through them to a location that Bai Xiaochun could not currently see. However, the aura he could sense surpassed any sort of god, as if that person were the lord of all living things. The Saint Emperor. Wait, no, the Paint Emperor. Muttering to himself in this way dispelled much of his nervousness. Having calmed himself down, he began to climb the stairs. As for the giant ghost king, his cultivation base was not as high as Bai Xiaochun's, nor did he have Bai Xiaochun's tricks to calm his heart. However, he was one of the 4 heavenly kings of the wildlands, so despite the pressure, and despite how much he was sweating, he took a few breaths and managed to calm down a bit. As he followed Bai Xiaochun up the stairs, the palace hall was slowly revealed in full, including the huge amount of people who were gathered there. When the two of them stepped off of the last step and into the hall, they found themselves in what was essentially a huge square. At the far end were 9 columns decorated with extremely lifelike carvings of dragons and phoenixes. In the middle of the 9 columns was a gigantic green cauldron. Green smoke curled up from the cauldron, rising into the sky to join the clouds. There were thousands of people making up the group that filled either side of the hall, all of whom stood motionless, looking respectfully toward the front of the hall. In front of the crowd were 2 stooped old men, their hands tucked into opposite sleeves, their heads bowed respectfully as they looked at the person at the very front of the entire hall. He did not wear imperial robes but instead, what seemed to be an ordinary green garment. He sat on a throne, reading an ancient scroll. He was middle-aged and handsome, seemingly genial, as though his smile could cause the spring wind to blow gently through the air. In fact, he seemed so friendly that anyone who looked at him would willingly sacrifice their life for him. Complete silence reigned. Apparently, until this man spoke, no one else in the hall would dare to do so. Not even Gu Tianjun said anything. He simply clasped hands in formal greeting, then stood off to the side, his head bowed. No one spoke or even moved, and no one looked at Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king. Everyone was waiting for the green-robed man to look up. Well, he certainly knows how to show off. Bai Xiaochun thought, his heart pounding. However, he reminded himself that he couldn't give in to fear. In fact, this Saint Emperor seemed to be going too far in his attempt to be dazzling. Thankfully, he didn't keep everyone waiting for too long. Once he sensed Bai Xiaochun's presence, his gaze shifted away from the ancient scroll. Looking at Bai Xiaochun, he smiled radiantly. It was like the blooming of 100 flowers, like the most refreshing of breezes. The imperial palace seemed to brighten, and the clouds up above danced in delight. The lotus flower that made up the palace seemed to stretch upward, causing an even more wonderful aroma to spread out. Out in the heavenly pond, the dragonfish swam back and forth in joy. I've heard quite a bit about you, fellow Taoist Bai. His words seemed to thrum with warmth and friendliness, and his eyes shone with a sincerity that made it seem impossible to doubt him. Bai Xiaochun held his breath as he was reminded of the first time he had laid eyes on the Arch-Emperor back in the wildlands. Taking a few steps forward, he clasped hands and bowed deeply, then spoke in a loud voice. Bai Xiaochun from the Heavenspan realm is here to offer greetings, Saint Emperor. I would also like to offer sincere thanks for your magnanimity. You have my gratitude for keeping the people of Heavenspan safe in your territory, and helping them adapt to life in the eternal lands. Being unable to pay you back for this favor, fellow Taoist giant ghost and I took a trip to the Vile Emperor dynasty. Originally, we planned to apprehend the Vile Emperor himself and deliver him to you. Sadly, I am too unfamiliar with the eternal immortal domains, and got a bit lost. Therefore, I took a random celestial to offer you as a gift. I know the gift isn't very impressive, but I hope you'll deign to accept it, Saint Emperor. During his speech, Bai Xiaochun made sure to add appropriate sighing where necessary, and in the end, plastered a look of deep regret on his face. In response to Bai Xiaochun's words, the Saint Emperor's smile stiffened a bit. Despite being a mighty emperor, even he was a bit taken aback by what he had just heard. If he reacted that way, then there was little need to mention how the rest of the officials responded. Many of them couldn't help but look over at Bai Xiaochun with strange expressions on their faces. Some seemed contemptuous, and others, leery. They had seen shameless people before, and in fact, being sanctimonious was a key feature of the people of the Saint Emperor dynasty. But the way Bai Xiaochun unblinkingly bragged about himself in outrageous fashion was something none of them had ever seen before. He went to capture the vile emperor, but he didn't know the way and couldn't find him? How utterly shameless. I can handle a bit of bragging, but this is too much. The giant ghost king blinked a few times. He had been nervous a moment ago, but when he looked over and saw Bai Xiaochun standing there with a wistful expression on his face, that anxiety melted away. Looking around, he suddenly felt like he wasn't in the eternal lands, but rather, back in the wildlands. I bet that it won't be long before everyone in the eternal immortal domains realizes how shameless he is, and how good he is at causing disasters. When Bai Xiaochun caught the reaction of the crowd, and noticed how stiff the Saint Emperor's smile had become, he felt very pleased with himself. He had been in a completely passive position before, but as of this moment, he had the upper hand. And that meant he had a big bargaining chip in this interchange. Just as he was trying to decide exactly how to word his next statement, a familiar voice could be heard from the group of cultivators on the left side of the hall. This is the Saint Emperor's palace, Bai Xiaochun. Don't even think about trying to run your mouth here. All of a sudden, someone stepped out from the crowd and clasped hands in formal greeting to the Saint Emperor. Your Majesty the Saint Emperor, I can list 300 crimes that this Bai Xiaochun has committed. But the worst of them is that of deceiving the sovereign. Your Majesty, please punish this Bai Xiaochun for his crimes. Lu Yang, Bai Xiaochun blurted, his jaw dropping. He hadn't been looking very closely at the crowd earlier, and therefore hadn't noticed that standing right there was Heavenly Marquis Lu from the Wildlands, the very same one who had once listed out 100 crimes. 1. Heavenly Marquis Lu didn't even look at Bai Xiaochun. He simply stood there, heart-pounding with excitement. Back when the people of Heavenspan were teleported into the Eternal Lands, he got lucky, and ended up right in Saint Emperor City. He was also one of the first to offer his services to the dynasty. He revealed much valuable information to the Saint Emperor, and was thus given an official position within the bureaucracy. Although it wasn't a very high position, he was still happy with it. And now here he was, facing the very same Bai Xiaochun who had forced him to flee to the Great Wall in fear. Now, he finally had a chance to finish what he had started in the Wildlands, and get his revenge. Even if a millennium passes, he thought, it is never too late for a gentleman to seek revenge. You slipped through my grasp in the Wildlands, Bai Xiaochun, but you won't do the same here. I'll list out 1,000 crimes if I have to. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.